Steve, I'd like to start with a fairly classical question. We've been teaching MBAs for over 100 years. We think we teach them management, finance, marketing, operations, strategy, but it seems to me that there's something missing in the classical MBA program. What is missing in a typical MBA program for somebody who wants to be an entrepreneur?
You know, how many of you have MBAs? Everything you learned, if you got your degree in the last, earlier than 3 years ago, is obsolete. Congratulations. And at least for entrepreneurship, not if you want to run a large company. I want to remind those of you who don't have an MBA what it actually stands for. MBA is the Master of Business Administration. Big idea, administration. The notion of the MBA, first graduating MBA class in the United States was Harvard in 1908, and the notion was to create a management class to run these new corporations that were actually forming in the United States. Steel companies, oil companies, food companies that were actually growing in scale and size, and there wasn't a professional management class. And so we decided to actually have a curriculum to educate administrators, people who could execute an existing company. So the curriculum for the MBA was how to run an existing company. The
Not
big
to
idea,
start the one.
how to run one. And it's not that we never understood that there were these things called startups, because in 1940, George Deroe at Harvard offered essentially the first entrepreneurship class. Stanford in the 1950s offered small business entrepreneurship classes. But here was the big idea. And this big idea actually is what kicked off the lean startup movement, is that a startup is not a smaller version of a large company. This is a huge idea. Nowadays, it's kind of like, well, we kind of understand that, but when I was an entrepreneur, that was not the case. Our investors taught us to do everything a large company did. A large company wrote a business plan, we wrote a business plan. A large company did a 5-year forecast, they made us do a 5-year forecast. A large company hired sales, marketing, business development VPs on day one, they told us to do that. And more importantly, our investors assumed that all we needed to do was execute the business plan just like a large company. Yet they were surprised when 90-some-odd% of us would fail. And they blamed it on us as the entrepreneurs. The big idea that kicked off the lean startup movement was not only startups aren't smaller versions of large companies, is that large companies execute known business models. What's a business model? Who's my customer? How do I price the product? Who's my competitors? What's my distribution channel? How do I get, keep, and grow customers? In a large company, you're large because you know that. And therefore, you hire people to execute. But in a startup, the thing that you're all doing, you're actually searching for a business model. And that's the core distinction in the lean startup movement. We built tools for 100 years for execution, but we had no tools. We didn't even have a language to describe that what we're actually doing is searching for a business model. What was your question?
It's wonderfully answered. I think it's a great spot to move in. What are some of the risks that an entrepreneur faces, and how would the entrepreneur mitigate them if the MBA program is not going to do it for them?
So one of the biggest both benefits and problems with being a founder of a company is a founder is driven by passion and faith. And in fact, on day one, a startup is closer to a religious organization than anything else. You're actually driven by your belief that you see something that no one else does. And in fact, that is not only the reason that you will succeed, that's also the reason why you will fail. Because very quickly, for a startup to succeed, you need to turn that faith into facts as rapidly as possible. The mistake is simply thinking that just because you believe, then therefore it exists. And the whole idea about the lean startup movement says, there are no facts inside your building. So why don't you get outside and try to get some facts as early as possible? And that was my contribution in this portion called customer development. And so the lean startup movement actually does three things. It says, let's take all your hypotheses. And by the way, I use this word hypotheses because at Stanford, where I teach, the students pay $50,000 a year, and their parents want to know they're learning very big words. But outside of Stanford, the word hypotheses means guess. And if you really think about it, most of your startups are based around a series of untested guesses. Though you might believe, and you might have convinced other employees to join, and you might have convinced even investors to give you some money, the odds are most of what you have are a series of untested guesses. And what we're going to do is have you write down those guesses, and we're going to use something called the Business Model Canvas by someone named Alexander Osterwalder. I would have added Alex's book to your reading list. His book is called Business Model Generation. And in one single diagram, one piece of paper, we could put all your guesses. All your guesses. Who are the customers? What am I building for them? What's the distribution channel? How do I get, keep, and grow them? What are the profits and losses and costs, etc.? And then the second thing we're going to do is get out of the building physically, and sometimes virtually, and test those hypotheses by doing the third thing, agile engineering and building minimum viable products. And so the lean startup consists of those three pieces: business model design to articulate or write down your hypotheses, customer development to get out and test them, and agile engineering to physically build iterative and incremental versions of the product before you ever do what we used to call first customer ship. In the lean method, you're continually testing the product almost from day one. And it's not just code. It could be a PowerPoint slide, could be wireframe, could be just data to get some early customer feedback. And what's interesting is the lean startup is basically maybe 5 years old. Yet MBAs have had 100 years of management stack, and we're just building kind of our stack of tools for entrepreneurs. Osterwalder came up with a business model canvas. I came up with customer development. Eric Ries came up with the insight that agile engineering is the best way to build MVPs. And so all of us have been adding to this management stack, and others, all the books you mentioned as well. And so entrepreneurship and tools for entrepreneurs, all of you are now the beneficiary in the 21st century of all this new thinking on how to think about startups. Again, I want to emphasize, if you're doing the same thing you would have done in a large company, you are going to go out of business. It's a big idea. Don't believe that just because you think so, it's going to happen.